Well, I'm a little late on this, but Mass Effect Legendary Edition is finally here. And as a huge fan of the Mass Effect series, I kinda went all out for this one. I even got the ridiculous Mass Effect Legendary Edition cache that came with an N7 acceptance letter, 2 canvas art prints, a spinner pin with the Paragon and Renegade logos, a Mass Effect Legendary Edition metal game case, and a wearable replica N7 helmet that lights up for Paragon and Renegade. This thing may not look it on video, but it's huge. I feel like Marty McFly when he's pretending to be Darth Vader from the planet Vulcan.
Silence, Earthling!
I mean, this cache came with everything you could want, except a copy of the game, or the full trilogy soundtrack. Okay, so it's missing a few obvious things, but we've been waiting for this remaster for so long now, and I let the excitement get to me. I even picked up a few other things that did not come in the cache. Now before we get started talking about the game, let's acknowledge that this is not a full-on remake. Set your expectations for remaster. That means it definitely looks better and runs better than it used to, but it's still the same game, warts and all. Let me also acknowledge my own bias that the Mass Effect universe is my favorite sci-fi universe, and while I can acknowledge the series' flaws, I still consider it my favorite game franchise. So there's that. There have been rumors for years that a remaster would come out one day so that we could experience the trilogy all over again, but hopefully without some of the jank that makes going back to that first game difficult for some. I mean, the first game came out 13 years ago, and I'm happy to report that the first Mass Effect game now looks great. The lighting and textures look great. At the time it didn't occur to me how dark the lighting was in a lot of the first game, but they really brightened up a lot of the game and it makes a huge difference. They also changed up the UI for the first game to be more consistent with the other games. They made it so you can run while not in combat, even if our super elite soldier can only run 10 steps before needing a breather. I mean, seriously, would unlimited run have hurt anything? They made it so any class can now use any weapon type effectively, even if they can't specialize in it, which means as an adept, I've been able to use assault rifles, which is pretty great. However, they did not bring forward the much better combat of Mass Effect 3 into the first two games. I'm sure that would have required a full rebuild of the game to make happen, but it's a bit of a bummer not to be able to use biotic and tech-based abilities to combine to create massive explosions. That was always so satisfying in Mass Effect 3, and it would have been cool to have had across the entire trilogy. As it is, the remaster makes shooting in the first game feel better, but power usage still feels a bit clunky, and targeting enemies to hit with abilities can feel imprecise. BioWare did make it so you level faster, however, and that means you can hit the max rank without having to do New Game Plus to get there. There are tons of other little quality of life improvements that make the first game that much more enjoyable. Maybe none more evident than the Mako sections. Now, don't get me wrong, they haven't massively overhauled the experience here, but things are definitely a bit better. Now, for those that never played the first Mass Effect, you could land on a bunch of different planets all over the place, and you'd drive around and find materials and encounter enemies and get some loot, and then you'd fly off to another place. This is how the first game handled a lot of its side quests. It was supposed to give you a grand sense of planetary exploration in a vast universe full of habitable planets, but each planet looked nearly completely deserted. Every planet looked essentially the same with just a color palette swap and a few points of interest to find. This was very likely due to limited budget and platform restrictions, but it didn't exactly make for super compelling side quests. Also, the controls for the Mako, your tank-like vehicle, were just awful. BioWare claims they've tweaked the controls to make them a bit better in the Legendary Edition, but they feel more or less the same as I remember. Or I should say they feel about what I would have expected them to be. I played the original back on the Xbox 360 and I'm playing the Legendary Edition on PC with mouse and keyboard. So I'm not sure if I'm misinterpreting the translation here, but the controls feel about like I would have expected them to. Which is to say, there's not really forward or reverse controls the way you'd get with most vehicles in a game. You're more going the direction your camera is pointed, which gets a little wonky when you're trying to reverse or you're dealing with lots of mountainous terrain. And there is lots of mountainous terrain. But they did add a boost feature to make planetary exploration go a bit quicker, and I'll give them credit, it looks like they went in and really tried to make the planets more visually appealing and at least somewhat different from one to the other. But I have to say, the Mako and the planetary exploration is where I hit the most jank, that trademark Mass Effect 1 jank where the frame rate slows down and you start getting hitches in the performance. In one section I actually had the Mako get stuck on a rock, and after sitting there for a few seconds trying to use the jump jets and the boost to get out of it, I randomly died and had to go replay a few minutes worth of content because of it. Again, I'm playing on PC and this is a game developed for consoles. I'm not sure how it runs on console, so your mileage may vary. You can tell the Mass Effect series was developed primarily for consoles and then ported to PC because the controls are clearly designed for a controller. It is a shooter, so I'd rather play it with a mouse and keyboard, but honestly, who maps sprint and action or interact to spacebar? So don't expect the Legendary Edition to have made any improvements to the control scheme. Anyway, so far I'm still working on the first game, so I haven't made it into Mass Effect 2 or 3 just yet, but I'm almost a little surprised how quickly the game sucked me in again. I haven't revisited the series in a few years, so I knew I'd enjoy playing it again, but there's really something to be said for the way the game sets up its central conflict and introduces you to the greater galactic community full of complex interspecies politics. Everyone wants their species to be respected within the galactic community, but humanity is the new kid on the block, and while earning favor with the Council has been tough, humanity is already getting more recognition than some species who've been on the scene longer. That isn't sitting well with some of them. But there's also a complicated history between the Krogan, the Solarians, and the Turians, and at the start of Mass Effect 1, we're also not terribly far removed from the first contact war between the humans and the Turians. So there's a lot of reason for the different races to be wary and untrusting of each other. There's a dense lore to the series that's well thought out and very interesting and fun to learn about. And exploring the Citadel again at the beginning of the first Mass Effect brought it all back to me again. This is what sucked me in so much the first time I played these games. I had never become so invested in a video game universe before. There are a lot of modern games that don't do story and world building this well. So it's cool to see that it still works so well so many years later. And it's key to remember the early distrust everyone here has as you continue to play through the series, because Shepard's mission really becomes one of uniting everyone for the common good. And that, for me, has always been one of the most satisfying elements of the series. And for first-time players, it's worth mentioning that the game never feels like it's providing its lore and backstory to you in boring exposition dumps. It often happens in conversation that you're free to seek out or not. I think the Mass Effect Legendary Edition is a great place to jump into the series if you've never played these games before. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of elements here that feel unmistakably of an older era in consoles, but the quality of life improvements are nice to see for returning players. And the good aspects of the Mass Effect series have, for me, always outweighed the bad. If you've never played this trilogy, I highly recommend picking up the Legendary Edition. It's 3 games for the price of 1, and if you've played it before and are on the fence, all I can say is, if you have any nostalgia for the series, you might find that revisiting after all these years sparks that love and intrigue you had for the series back when you first experienced it. And having it all packaged together in this way is a nice way to get back into the series. As for my hopes of the future of the Mass Effect franchise, the first is that BioWare is able to bring back Mass Effect 3's cooperative multiplayer mode at some point. There have been some rumblings about it possibly being added later if there's enough interest from the fanbase. In an interview with CNET, project director Mac Walters said he'd never say no to bringing it back, but that'll depend on the Legendary Edition's reception and demand for the mode by the fans. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. My second hope is that one of these days, probably years and years down the line, that BioWare does do a full-on Final Fantasy VII style remake of the trilogy, where everything is rebuilt from the ground up, fixing everything and bringing everything from the controls to the RPG elements up to a more modern standard. They could even do the Final Fantasy VII remake thing of setting it in an alternate universe to give them the creative freedom to make some changes to the story, including taking another pass at that controversial ending. Even as I say this, it sounds wildly unlikely even to me, but hey, I can dream, right? And finally, I hope that whatever the next Mass Effect game ends up being, that they knock it out of the park. I really want the Mass Effect universe to come back in a big way. And I fear that if the next Mass Effect game isn't a major success, that may be it for the franchise. So hopefully they get it right. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. If you've been playing Mass Effect, let me know your thoughts on it. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like, hit the subscribe button for more videos, and I'll catch you on the next one.